Our topic tonight is the lost 10 tribes of Israel. This was a topic that I think arose in the comments just a few weeks ago. Leandro was saying, oh, you should do a lecture on that. And so that took hold and we decided to put this on the schedule. It has been kind of a fun one to research. So the tribes of Israel. According to the Bible, prior to the reign of their kings, the Israelites were divided into tribes who were led by what usually the English translation of this is judges. Shofet, I guess, is the Hebrew word. And so really, if we were translating this today, we might say something more like chieftains, because again, these are more primitive tribes as opposed to, anyway, judges we think of as a fairly, in our legal system and things like that. Anyway, we have ideas of what judges are like and kings too that maybe aren't too applicable to the Iron Age and the Bronze Age. In the book of Judges, the Israelites are regularly oppressed by their neighbors, including neighboring peoples like the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Amalekites. And so what will usually happen is the people will start to really prosper in the land, they'll get rich, they'll become proud, they'll start to worship other gods, they forget their God, the God of Israel. Then when they are in that kind of condition, God will send the Philistines to come in and conquer them and start oppressing them, and then everyone remembers, oh yeah, we forgot. And so they will remember God in order to complain to God. God will then raise up a deliverer, one of these judges. The judge will then demonstrate God's commitment to the people, freeing the people and so forth. And then there will be 40 years of peace. And that's, again, a kind of a magic number indicating a generation, kind of indicating a cycle occurring essentially in a heroic age as opposed to actual history, since it's even very formulaic, saying essentially the 40 years, saying a generation and so forth. But even though we have that account in the Bible, when that time period, when that text was actually being written down and composed is many centuries later. So although that book of Judges is set in that heroic age that may have occurred between, let's say, 1200 and 1050 before the Common Era, the actual book is part of the Deuteronomistic history that was edited together beginning at the time of King Josiah, kind of at the earliest, so the late 7th century BCE. A bunch of biblical scholars want to put it later, so the exile or even when they come back. I tend to kind of feel like it's maybe at this time period at the end of the Judahite, independent Judahite kingdom is when kind of this flourishing of some of this literary, proto-biblical literary writing is occurring. But in other words, it's taking place after the fall of the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Samaria, the northern kingdom, the kingdom wherein the 12 tribes are, after that's already fallen to the Assyrian Empire. So in other words, the texts about the lost 10 tribes don't get written down until after they're already lost in that sense. So what are all of these stories? The neighbors of the kingdom of Judah, then, the kingdom that's kind of left over as a tributary of the Assyrian Empire after the fall of the northern kingdom. All of them and their neighbors, including the Philistines, by the time period the Bible stories are written down, all shared related languages and customs. So although people remembered that the Philistines had come as sea peoples, invaders from across the sea with potentially kind of proto-early Greek or Mycenaean style customs and so forth, which is why the giant Goliath is sort of almost like a Homeric hero and talking about more or less in Greek armor and this sort of thing. Nevertheless, as often happens when you have a small elite group that comes and takes over a place, what ends up happening is that they start to adopt the customs and language of the majority population in the place where they settle. And so ultimately the Philistines lose their original language and then just speak the regular local Canaanite / Phoenician, Israeli, all those same language, this Canaanite language that they're all speaking. Likewise, all of the other neighbors, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and so forth. So in telling origin stories about all of these different peoples that are set in a heroic past, the authors of the Bible, writing at the time then of the Assyrians, when the Assyrians have hegemony over this whole area, the authors of the Bible are attempting to explain how closely the people of Judah are related to their surrounding neighbors. And so they set this in the stories of a heroic early family, the family of Abraham, who is sort of the patriarch who is the progenitor of all of this. So Abraham starts off in the land of Ur of the Chaldees, in other words, over in the land of Sumeria, Chaldea, the area that is in southern Iraq, southern lower Mesopotamia. And Abraham's father, according to the Bible, is a character named Terah. And Terah has a couple other sons, including a guy named Haran and another guy named Nahor, and that starts to create a family. In some of the tellings, Sarah, Abraham's wife, is also one of Terah's children, and so in other words, Abraham and Sarah, in some of the tellings of the story in the Bible, are brother and sister. Anyway, so this creates a biblical family, and as you see, the different realms around Israel are then actually have eponymous ancestors from this Abrahamic family. And so Israel itself it takes its name from another character whose other name is Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel by God, and so that's the eponymous ancestor of the kingdom of Israel. Jacob's brother is Esau, who is Edom, one of the other kingdoms. His Abraham's nephew, Bethuel, is the father of Aram, so the eponymous ancestor of the Arameans. And Abraham's nephew Lot gives birth via his own daughters to the Ammonites and the Moabites. And meanwhile, Abraham's eldest son, Ishmael, is also the ancestor, according to all of the biblical accounts here, of the Bedouins, the Arabians, the Ishmaelites, and so forth. So we'll see kind of how this works. I want to show it in how it's told in Genesis. So in terms of the kinship with the Ishmaelites and the other Bedouins, we read in Genesis 16 that because, kind of says the lead up to this, because Sarai, the original name for Sarah, is childless, she tells Abram, her husband, who is later changed to Abraham, to sleep with her Egyptian slave Hagar. But when Hagar became pregnant, Sarai thought better of this plan. She doesn't like the plan anymore. She now thinks that Hagar is too uppity and is taking her rightful place. She changes her mind and she ultimately drives Hagar out of their camp with Abram's consent. And so as Hagar is off in the wilderness in the desert, an angel appears to her. She becomes a prophet in her own right, and the angel tells her, quote, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." And so this is one of the first examples we'll see here, and it happens all the time here in this part of Genesis, where the authors of Genesis use essentially a folk etymology in order to create why a people are named a certain thing. And so there are, one of the contemporary peoples are the Ishmaelites, who are one of the tribes of desert Bedouins. And so the name Ishmael in Hebrew means God hears. And so, the Lord has heard your misery. God hears. So that is why he's called that in the reverse engineering, the folk etymology that is created for his name in this story. So this is how then the people of Judah, via Abraham, are distant kin with the Bedouins in the wilderness, the deserts around them. The Bible indicates that Judah's Bedouin neighbors are descended from Abraham by, on the one hand, Hagar and his son Ishmael, and then later, after Sarah dies, Abraham has another wife, another handmaiden, a concubine named Keturah, and Keturah bears 6 sons, Zimram, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And the Midianites, again, are another common name for Bedouins. And so, in other words, these are all part of the Abrahamic family, although via concubines, according to the biblical account. Genesis also gives Abrahamic kinship to the Ammonites and the Moabites, who were descended from Abraham's nephew Lot. Lot is famous for the guy he's living off in Sodom and Gomorrah, and his wife is the one who turns into a pillar of salt as she looks back. In telling the story of this lineage, however, the authors of the Bible undercut the Ammonites and the Moabites by telling a story that both peoples are the product of bad incest, when Lot's daughters get him drunk twice in order to seduce him. So we read in Genesis 19 that Lot and his 2 daughters were living in a cave, and one day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old and there's no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. So let's get our father to drink wine, and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." So after they do that one night and then a second night for the second one, both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab, and he is the father of the Moabites today. And the younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Beni-Ami, and he is the father of the Ammonites today. So just to go back to the chart here then, we have Abraham and Hagar to make the Ishmaelites, the Bedouins. Abraham I don't have on the chart here, but as another later concubine wife, Keturah, for all the other Bedouins. And then Abraham's brother, his nephew Lot, they're the children by his daughters, Moab and Ben-Ami. The Arameans, by contrast, as we think of the language Aramaic, this is the kind of native name for Syria and the Syrians. Syria is the Greek name that the Greeks applied to this whole area. But anyway, the Arameans are presented in a better light. So Isaac's wife, Rebekah, and her brother Laban, who is the father of Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, and their father Bethuel are said to be Arameans, originally from a place called Padan Aram, which is equated with Haran in Upper Mesopotamia. So kind of halfway on the Fertile Crescent in the trip that Abraham and his family make from Lower Mesopotamia, from Sumeria, to this promised land in Lesser Syria in Canaan. So anyway, this particular family is descended from Abraham's brother Nahor. So here's how it's kind of told in the Bible in Genesis 22. Sometime after the birth of Isaac, Abraham was told, "Milcah is also a mother. She has borne sons to your brother Nahor. Uz, the firstborn, Buz, his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram," so in other words, the father of the Syrians, Kesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. This is really Reverend Lovejoy stuff. I love this. Anyway, Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. So we read in Genesis 25 that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padan Aram, and the sister of Laban the Aramean. So the Arameans here are close kin. So we can kind of see how, again, that fits in. Bethuel, Aram, through Laban, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. So in other words, all of this family are intermarried very closely with the patriarchs Isaac and Jacob. The Edomites are given an even closer relationship with the Israelites. So Edom is, Ammon and Moab are the lands on the other side of the Jordan and the Dead Sea, modern day Jordan. Edom is the area south, the desert area south of the Dead Sea, so the Negev. So their eponymous ancestor, Esau, is made the elder twin brother of Jacob himself, so Jacob who becomes Israel. But once again, the stories undercut Esau, the ancestor of the Edomites, who is fooled by Jacob into selling his birthright for porridge and who has his father's blessing stolen by Jacob. So Esau, is not presented as the brightest bulb in the pack in the Bible. So we read in Genesis 25, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife, Rebekah, because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled with each other within her, and she says, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." So here's a destiny between these eponymous ancestors of the Israelites and the Edomites. The Edomites are going to be the elder ones, so Esau is born slightly before Jacob, who is clasping kind of fighting with him in the womb to get out first, and he's holding on back on his little leg as he's trying to get out first. But in any event, the younger one here, according to this prophecy given to Rebekah, is going to be served by the older. We read in Genesis 25 later on here that the boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay home among the tents. Isaac, the dad here, who has a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. One day, Jacob was cooking some stew, and Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew, I'm famished." And it says here very explicitly, that is why he is called Edom. And so Edom here in Hebrew, again, is another one of these folk etymologies and puns. Edom means red in Hebrew, and so essentially they're saying that this is why he's asking for red stew or whatever. Rather, it's again reverse engineered. In other words, it's called Edom first, and then later they make this story. So Jacob replied, first sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is a birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then he got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. So whatever the symbolism of the birthright, it's not as important to Esau as being able to eat when he's absolutely starving here. He's not willing to sacrifice a little bit of hardship in order to preserve something symbolic like this. Whereas Jacob sees this as being more important and is able then to kind of essentially cheat his brother. There's another story then of, with Rebekah's help, Jacob steals also a blessing that Isaac meant to give Esau, just kind of told quickly. Isaac, even though he's the patriarch, he's been pretty bumbling. Rebekah always is able to win. We're going to have a lecture on kind of the powerful matriarchs of the Bible, and in some ways the women in Genesis are interestingly the stronger characters, and that certainly comes out in the story of Isaac and Rebekah. But Isaac, anyway, is an old patriarch. He loves his son Esau. He loves that savory meat. He wants Esau to go out and go hunting for him, which Esau goes and does. And as soon as that happens, Rebekah has Jacob kill one of their goats or one of their lambs, and she prepares it as if it were the kind of a game meat. And then he comes in, and then he brings that into his father. He gets there obviously much earlier than you could have done by hunting and catching. And because Isaac is blind, he puts like a goat skin on his sleeves in order for him to feel kind of how his hairy son Esau. Isaac is leery of the whole thing, but he's tricked into thinking it's Esau, and so he gives him essentially the patriarchal blessing that is promising and predicting great things for him. And so when Esau comes back, and Isaac realizes he's been tricked, he doesn't have any great blessings left to give to Esau, and so forth. He's already provided all that spiritual mojo to his younger son. So essentially you can then kind of then see then in this tree here, Isaac and Rebekah's twin sons, Esau and Jacob, Edom and Israel, close relatives. Obviously the Edomites are the very near neighbors then of the people of Judah. So we can kind of see at the very south tip there, Judah at the west side of the Dead Sea and Edom on the south side. That brings us then to the 12 tribes themselves. So of all of the neighbors of Judah, those whose relationship was perceived to be the closest, according to the biblical accounts, were listed among the 12 tribes of Israel, about 10 of which were understood to have been part of the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria we might call it, prior to its destruction by the Assyrian Empire in 721 BCE. But again, all of these stories are written after that. So there might have been some traditions that go back as early as that, but these are being written down or composed in a time period when they've already ceased to have an independent identity. There are still people from those tribes living in the land in the northern kingdom, but it's in provinces under the Assyrian Empire, directly ruled by the Assyrians. And then there are some exiles who are from the elites of those places who have moved to Judah. And there are other exiles who have been forcibly deported by the Assyrians to their heartland in northern Mesopotamia, northern Iraq. So we'll just go through each of these 12 tribes in order, the birth order as explained in the Bible anyway, and where they are. So it begins with Reuben. You can see the territory there just to the east of the Dead Sea, northeast. Simeon at the very southwest of the area. Third is Levi. So Levi is the eponymous ancestor for the Levite, what's called the Levite tribe, but essentially it's a tribe that doesn't actually have any territory because this is the priestly caste, the caste of Levites. 4 then is Judah, this territory which is the kingdom that's left over after the Assyrians have conquered the rest. Then 5 is Dan. Dan is, the bulk of territory is just to the northwest of Judah, but there's also a story where they went and migrated up north of the Sea of Galilee too, and they have a little outpost up there. Naphtali, number 6, around the Sea of Galilee. Gad, number 8, Asher by the Phoenicians. Number 9, Issachar. Number 10, Zebulun. 11A is Joseph, but Joseph's 2 sons are actually give their names to half tribes, then later full tribes. So Joseph's son Ephraim, and then 11B with the best and the biggest territory, Manasseh, Joseph's son Manasseh. And then finally Benjamin, between Ephraim and Judah. Okay, so here's then kind of that map of all of those relatives, the Arameans, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, and then also all of the 12 tribes who are related to, it's actually, you can see there's actually 13. So even though it's called the 12 tribes, it's going to be, that's going to be problematic from the time. There's 12 territories. The tribe of Levi doesn't have a territory. But the tribe of Joseph is actually recognized as 2 different tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, which are the heartland of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. So here then is a chart that's showing how the eponymous ancestors of the 12 tribes fit together. So they're all the sons of Israel, the guy who's originally named Jacob in the Bible. And Jacob has 2 principal wives, Leah and Rachel. And Leah and Rachel each have a handmaiden who becomes a concubine to Jacob, and that's where then all of these sons come in these birth orders. So 6 sons by Leah, 2 sons by Rachel, and then Joseph, her elder son, has 2 sons that are tribes, and then 2 sons each by Zilpah and Bilhah. So I'm going to show this story a little bit in detail, because I think it's a great story, and it's sad and tragic, but it's also an entertaining story that I think explains, as it's explaining this origin, we get a sense of, anyway, where these stories came from and how they work. So this is the story of Jacob and Leah and Rachel. So Jacob agreed to work for his uncle Laban the Aramean for 7 years in exchange for his lovely younger daughter Rachel's hand in marriage. However, Laban ends up tricking Jacob into marrying his older daughter, Leah. So we read in Genesis 29, Jacob said to Laban, my time here is completed. I've worked for you for 7 years. Give me my wife. I want to make love to her. So Laban brought together all the people of the place, and he gave a feast. But when the evening came, he took his daughter Leah, and he brought her to Jacob. And Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When the morning came, there was Leah. And so Jacob said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? Laban replied, it is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. So finish this daughter's bridal week. Then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years' work. So Jacob ends up having to, ends up having to work another 7 years. There's a great, this is a lesson in The Fiddler on the Roof where Parachik, who's the young intellectual who gives it his interpretation, he says, and thus the Bible teaches you can never trust an employer. So anyway, and so Jacob does exactly that. Then he finishes the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel also to be a wife. So now he's married both sisters. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And he then worked for Laban another 7 years. So that creates then the situation that is leading to this family. Jacob is married to Leah and Rachel, and then there's the 2 maidservants. So when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. So this has been an ongoing theme, actually. Sarah was unable to give birth. She was barren, as was Rebecca initially, and then finally, obviously here now, Rachel as well. So this is a strong theme in Genesis. Certainly fertility was a major concern, obviously, and throughout antiquity and still to this day. But they also, obviously, they didn't have the sorts of scientific processes that we have now that are available to us. So Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, it is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. So that's a very sad statement, obviously. And so this brings us again back to, I mentioned these folk etymologies. So Reuben means kind of literally see a son, but apparently it's also a pun in Hebrew for he has seen my misery. So she says, the Lord has seen my misery, surely my husband will love me now. So essentially what they're doing here is there is a tribe that's existing that are called Reubenites. And so in order to create essentially the story about where they came from, they assume that there's an antonymous ancestor, Reuben. And so now, using kind of a folk etymology or a pun, the clever author here is, in speaking to the audience will say, oh, I see what they did there. He's made a pun, he's seen my misery. And so that's where the name comes from. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, because the Lord heard that I'm not loved, he gave me this one too. So she named him Simeon. And Simeon here might mean, according to, anyway, how the Hebrew works, one who hears. because the Lord heard I'm not loved, she's saying. Again, Leah, conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, now, at last, my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. So he was named Levi, and Levi sounds like the Hebrew word for attached, so again, another pun. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, this time I will praise the Lord. So she named him Judah, which sounds like the word for praise in Hebrew, and then she stopped having children. And so we have got, therefore, these tribes we've mentioned before and where they are: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, who has no territory, and Judah. So these are all in the kind of southern area. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, Rachel, the beloved, attractive wife, but also one that doesn't have it, is barren, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, give me a child or I'll die. Jacob became angry with her and said, am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children? What can he do about it, in other words? Then she said, here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. And Rachel names him. So Rachel says, God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son. Because of this, she named him Dan. And so Dan means he has vindicated. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, I've survived a great struggle with my sister and I've won. So she named him Naphtali. And Naphtali means my struggle. So we have all of the ones that we've had. And so now we add to that Dan and Naphtali. And so those are kind of in the next areas. 2 can play at the servant game. So when Leah saw that she'd stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, what a good fortune, and she named him Gad, which means good fortune. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, how happy I am. The women will call me happy. So she named him Asher, which means happy. So there we are, Gad and Asher. So we can see now kind of the whole. So this is actually, as the story is going, it's going all around these to the periphery of the heartland of Israel, right? And so the heartland of the northern kingdom, which is Manasseh and Ephraim, essentially now we're doing around once all the edges on the north and the south. Okay, so this continues. Oopsie. I missed a slide. So anyway, what happens is Rachel is still not able to have any children, but Leah's oldest son, Reuben, has found a plant called mandrakes. This plant is felt to have magic powers, magic fertility powers. And so Rachel asks Leah, give me those mandrakes, because I need to have something here in order, she needs to be able to do anything in order to have children. She wants to be able to have her own children, not just her maidservant's children. And Leah says, you've taken my husband from me, or you're also going to take my son's mandrakes. And she says, look, if you give me the mandrakes, I'll let you sleep with our husband again. And so they make that deal. And so Leah, having given the mandrakes to Rachel, she comes to Jacob and says, I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. In other words, I've been able to buy access to the bed. So he, who's, again, just like with Isaac, it's kind of, again, these matriarchs who are in charge, certainly over all of the domestic situation and really who's getting to sleep with anybody. Even this happened with Sarah and Abraham. So again, Sarah is the one that suggested Hagar, and then when she gets upset at Hagar, she goes to Abraham and complains, and he says, well, look, it's none of my business. Your servant is in your power. So she is cruel to her, and she drives her away. In the same way here, the women are making the deals about who Jacob is going to sleep with. So he slept with Leah that night. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a 5th son. Then Leah said, God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband. So she named him Issachar. And Issachar is a pun on the word for reward. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has presented me with a precious gift. This time, after 6 sons, she's still hoping my husband will treat me with honor because I have borne him 6 sons. And so she named him Zebulun, which might mean, or it could be a pun for honor. So Issachar, Zebulun, so now we really have filled out the entire periphery. And sometime later, Leah gave birth to a daughter named Dinah, and she figures into a story that takes place in the northern kingdom later. And then God finally remembers Rachel. He listens to her, and he enabled her to conceive. No word here from the Bible whether the mandrakes actually had any help in this, but anyway, God enables her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. So she named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son. And so Joseph here is a folk etymology is may he add. She wants another son too. So Joseph becomes kind of the central character going there then on. He becomes obviously his father Jacob's favorite son. He's given this coat that's translated in English anyway as the coat of many colors. The famous musical, the Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. His brothers become jealous. They conspire to sell him into slavery. They sell him to a slaver caravan, which ends up taking him to Egypt, where he starts off in prison, but he ends up, he's such a great and honest and important person that he ends up rising to become the Pharaoh's vizier, which is to say like his prime minister, his number one guy, so that he pretty much has authority over the whole of Egypt. Egypt has predicted, Joseph predicts through interpreting Pharaoh's dreams that Egypt is going to have a whole long famine cycle, and he's able to prepare for it and save everybody from dying of the famine. And so while that famine is taking place, while Joseph is at the height of his power, 2 sons, we read in Genesis 41, were born to Joseph by Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and he said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. And so Manasseh here sounds like the Hebrew word to forget, so another folk etymology for that. And the second son he named Ephraim, saying, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. And Ephraim, again, is a pun for twice fruitful. It sounds like twice fruitful, and so there we are. We rounds out those tribes. So half of Joseph's tribe, Ephraim here. This is sort of the most important area or the capital of the northern kingdom. And indeed, a lot of times, if we are biblically, if they're going to talk about essentially the northern and southern kingdoms, they will call them Judah, just part for the whole, and the northern part Ephraim, because this is where the center of Samaria is, Ephraim. And then the other big part, Manasseh, in 2 portions on either side of the Jordan, Joseph's other son. Finally, Rachel has her second son, but in tragic circumstances. So we read in Genesis 35, they moved on from Bethel, which is to say Jacob's family. While they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, don't despair, for you have another son. And as Rachel breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Ben-Oni, which means son of my trouble. But his father named him Benjamin, which is to say son of my right hand. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is to say Bethlehem. So that leaves us the last then of the 12 tribes, Benjamin, who becomes his father's new favorite since he thinks his old favorite Joseph has been killed and he's actually been sold into slavery. And so that gives us actually 13 tribes that make up the 12 tribes. So those are the stories and the eponymous ancestors, how they fit together both in terms of the biblically described geography and also the biblically described familial birth order and connection and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that this is kind of a courtly narrative, what I've just read, and I read kind of at length because it's a clever story, it's an entertaining story, and you can kind of also see how the author is crafting a story using puns and folk etymologies in order to derive names that were already existing. In other words, to understand and take a name that exists for an existing tribal group and to now explain why that fits into the mythic origins of the family of Israel. So the tale of the sons of Israel is an entertaining one. It has courtly values. So one of the things, in a courtly setting here is this idea of the competition among the wives of the king to produce favorite heirs. So this is something, the kings of Judah have multiple wives, and depending on which son is the one that is the favorite of the king, that wife is going to be, more powerful at court than all of her rivals. And so on, the favored wife, for example, like in the story of David, Bathsheba, her son is Solomon. And so she wants to, she is opposed to the wives whose sons are people like Absalom and so forth. And so in this very same way, that kind of actual courtly intrigue that would have been happening in the court of Judah, the story plays out with those same kind of themes that the audience would be interested in hearing. So the source texts here, that eventually the proto-texts that got edited together to make what we now have as the book of Genesis, may have been composed to be read by an audience who are the courtiers around the time of King Josiah in order to create eponymous ancestors for the contemporary tribal groups, like I say, using clever puns for their names. So prior to its destruction by Assyria in 721 BCE, the kingdom of Israel actually was Israel. It was the important part. Judah was simply an undeveloped, poor neighbor. Jerusalem's rise really only occurs after Israel's destroyed and incorporated into Assyria, and after some of the elite, some of the northern exiles, moved to Judah in the 7th century BCE. Those are the people who, along with the local Judahite elite down there too, helped to create this proto-biblical literature, including these courtly stories about the king's royal ancestor. So the king in Jerusalem is from the royal house, which is called the House of David. That's the dynastic name. And so there is a presumed ancestor of that house named David. They may not know anything about him other than that name, but now they create a whole bunch of stories and legends and so forth in order to honor the current king. That's one of the things that you do when you have, when you're in a court and you have, essentially the patron is the king, and part of the entertainment is telling these sorts of stories and writing them down and so forth. So among the things that are created is in fact the myth that the king of Judah's eponymous ancestor David had once ruled over a united Israel. So the way we read about it in the book of Kings now is that, and Samuel and Kings, is that all of the 12 tribes were united, and David and Solomon were kings of the whole area, and their capital was Jerusalem, even though when it splits apart later in the narrative, the northern kingdom continues to be called Israel and is much larger, and it consists of the 10 tribes, whereas the capital is simply of a rump that's left over, Judah, and 2 tribes. However, archaeology has really shown, just in the last few decades, that Jerusalem at that time, the time period when David and Solomon would have been alive, Jerusalem was simply a tiny little hill town, and it could never have been the capital of a vast kingdom. And so by creating this kind of myth of the United Kingdom, that is connecting the southern kings that are now the only game left in town, that is connecting them with Israel's history, the history of the northern kingdom, and actually elevating them above all of the greater kings that had existed in Israel when it had been its own own independent kingdom. And so then, in addition to that, creating eponymous ancestors for both northern and southern tribal groups, and then connecting them together as brothers in one big family of Israel, added an even closer kinship. So, what can we say then about actual tribes? So while these eponymous ancestors are all mythic, it is true that the people of Israel, the people of Judah, and their neighbors were actually all related, and they're all native to the area of Canaan, and it simply suited Judah and the exiles from Israel that were in their court to kind of paint a closer relationship to each other, while at the same time, let's say, depreciating and making fun of the people who are still kind of independent, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites. In other words, those guys are also related, but they're kind of more presented as our neighbors, the bumpkins, are kind of a dumb or cheap cousins or whatever, the cousins we trick, as opposed to us that have always been united together as the kind of the smart ones in the family. One thing that we can say, though, is that there never actually were many more than 12 tribes. So eventually they create a list, and the story creates how they're all related to each other in a family. But actually, some of the tribes that we know of that exist didn't make it on that list, and other ones who aren't really important actually did make it on the list. So one of the ways we can tell that is by looking at other lists that occur in the Bible. So the Song of Deborah, found in Judges 5, it's thought to be one of the oldest kind of source texts that existed before the Bible was written down and then got included in the Bible. So the Song of Deborah actually only mentions 8 of the traditional 12 tribes. So it mentions Ephraim, Benjamin, Zebulun, Issachar, Reuben, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. But you can see then it's leaving off the list as important things as Judah. It's not being mentioned. And it includes as tribes, instead of Manasseh, groupings that are later kind of combined in Manasseh's territory in the final list, Gilead and Machir. And so actually, just the way it's kind of described in the book of Judges, kind of the tribe of Gilead, seems like it was actually fairly important, even though it ultimately doesn't get remembered that way when the 12, when the 12 are created into that the story of the 12 sons of Israel. Other variations and problems with the tribal list. Well, so other biblical tribes of Israel included the Kenites, that are down there next to the Judahites. They were listed as relatives of Moses, and even other tribes are kind of their subclans, the Rechabites, the Jerahmeelites, and so on. Those could have made the list and didn't. The descendants of the Judahite hero Caleb are sometimes singled out in the book of Judges as having their own Calebite tribe and inheritance around Hebron. The Simeonites are another problem. So they did make the official list, but actually their territory is kind of vague, sort of to the southwest of Judah, but maybe fully encompassed by Judah. And even though when we think of the lost 10 tribes, we think of it's the northern kingdom that were taken away by the Assyrians. The northern kingdom didn't take the Simeonites away. In other words, the Simeonites weren't up in the north. And so why the Simeon becomes one of the lost 10 tribes isn't as clear from that standpoint. So there's some variations and problems in the tribal lists. We mentioned even the fact is that there's kind of, even on the official list, there's 13 tribes in a way. So by the time, one of the other issues though is by the time the list of the tribes was created, 10 of the tribes on the list had already been lost. So in other words, these are being written down after the deportation that takes place when the Assyrians destroyed the kingdom of Israel in 721. So what ends up happening is the Assyrians deport portions of the nobility, the priestly and warrior and other propertied class into exile. They take them to northern Iraq. As we see, other elites flee into Judah. But of course, what always happens in a conquest or even in this kind of a deportation era and everything like that, their capacity to take anybody, they're only taking the people that have money or the people that are not peasants. The people who are the farmers, who are representing 90+ by far % of the population, they all stayed there. The majority of the population continues to be there, but they just don't count in anybody's book. So unlike the Judahite exile elite that are exiled to Babylon a century later when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, that exile group, even though they do to some extent Babylonianize and adopt lots and lots of Babylonian and later Persian ideas, that group nevertheless maintains a coherent identity as Judeans, and a group of them, the elite there, later goes back to Jerusalem, rebuilds the temple, and so forth. Unlike that Judean elite group, the Israelite elite in northern Mesopotamia ultimately assimilates entirely into northern Mesopotamian society, and they lost their distinct identity as Israelites. So in other words, they aren't lost in the sense of people who continue to have an Israel identity and are lost because we don't know where they are in a physical geographic sense. They are lost in the sense that they no longer have that identity. They are now just regular northern Iraqi people, as opposed to people that are living in exile who are maintaining a separate identity. And meanwhile, like I say, and continue to point out, in antiquity, people don't really care about the common people, even though they make up by far and away the majority of the people. But that huge majority of the population continued to live in Samaria, where their descendants are the Samaritans, the Palestinians, the Syrians, down to this day. So in other words, those people largely, once a people get to any place and populate to the extent that they are filling out kind of an agricultural distribution of a population, when any kind of a conqueror comes in, even if you bring new colonists and anything, no matter how many times you've been conquered, you're still going to make up the bulk of the population will still be from that original stock. I mean, obviously, everybody's constantly interbreeding and all those sorts of things, but their descendants are still there. Okay, nevertheless, despite the fact that the tribes are not actually extant and merely lost somewhere in a physical sense, the very name, the Lost 10 Tribes, has evoked an amazing number of ideas about where they might be, including, for example, hiding at the center of the hollow earth. Maybe you didn't all realize this, but our earth is actually hollow, and there's a sun in the middle of it, and there's a hole of it at the two different poles, and you can go, if you hit it at the right moment with an airplane, you can fly down into it. At least this is what I was taught as a 14-year-old by a Sunday school teacher in LDS Sunday School. And he drew this on the chalkboard in the classroom in the church, and he kind of showed his kind of theory anyway, that the earth is hollow and that the top 10 tribes are living in there. And since the end of the world was going to happen quite soon, one of the prophecies and predictions is that the 10 tribes will come back out of the north. And boy, that makes a lot of sense, because that's where the hole in the earth is. And so they're going to come out of the north in the end times, which, by the way, we're also already supposed to have happened. We were not supposed to make it all the way to 2022. It would have been happening before this. Anyway, didn't happen, and turns out the earth isn't hollow. So that's one of the places, though, where people have imagined, including my own lifetime, where the lost 10 tribes are hiding. There are all kinds of other different ideas, and they are actually none of them any more accurate than this one. So, from the 17th to the early 19th centuries, European Americans speculated that the peoples of the Western Hemisphere may have been descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel. So Europeans, when the Age of Discovery began, were becoming biblical literalists, and they had started to study the Bible and think of it as, like I say, a kind of a literalistic history. And so they thought, if there was a universal flood where everybody and everything on the world was killed, and everybody then in the old world are descended from the children of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, where did all of these people that are living in North America, in South America, how did they get here? And so one of the ideas that was circulating both in the Spanish speaking part and the Spanish colonies and so forth, but also in Anglo-North America, is that the lost tribes had made their way somehow. And there were multiple different books throughout all those centuries that are kind of describing those theories, that are coming up with all kinds of parallelisms, that are saying Native Americans do this and this and this and this custom, and this is the exact same thing that the Hebrews do in the book of Judges, and so thus we see that they're probably the same. This word in just one native language, obviously the natives speak so many different languages and things like that, but this word in Cherokee sounds like this word in Hebrew. In other words, this is the kind of scholarship that was based on. So the Book of Mormon, which emerged in the 1820s under Joseph Smith Jr.'s dictation process, includes this idea. So the Book of Mormon is an explanation of how, given that sort of biblical worldview, like I say, of where everybody is descendants from Noah's, literally from the people who were on the ark and so forth, it describes both how the animals and how different peoples come to the Americas in multiple migrations, but one of the migrations, the one that is this kind of central story, is talking about a family led by the father, the patriarch of the family, named Lehi. And Lehi is said to be a descendant of Joseph, so part of that Josephite tribe that is divided into Ephraim and Manasseh, and so apparently a Manassehite. And his family then is already living in exile in the Judahite kingdom because the northern kingdom has already been destroyed by the Assyrians, and he and his family then migrate from Jerusalem to the New World around 600 BCE, so in other words, before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. And in this particular, they don't do this pageant anymore, but the Hill Cumorah pageant that's done across, the LDS Church would put on across the lake, Ontario from here. In Palmyra, Jesus, on the stage here, which is all dressed up like a Mesoamerican pyramid, Jesus arrives and talks to all of the Lamanite and Nephite peoples who were descendants from these Manassehites, this particular remnant of the lost tribes. So it's not just that. So as Europeans went around everywhere, they entertained similar speculation about all sorts of other peoples, including the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Maori of New Zealand, and more. Tudor Parfit has a book called The Lost Tribes of Israel, The History of a Myth, and he writes that the spread of the fantasy of Israelite origin forms a consistent feature of the Western colonial enterprise, and he singles out kind of the speculation that Europeans had in the 19th century about the Japanese being the lost 10 tribes. He says it's in fact in Japan that we can trace the most remarkable evolution in the Pacific of an imagined Judaic past. Essentially the kind of the arrogance here that develops among the Europeans is anybody who seems to be kind of interestingly civilized, they must have a biblical Israelite origin, because there's no way that alternate cultures have their own innovation and depth and things like that. They should all be, savages and so forth as opposed to Europeans. And so if they're not, because we go around and we find out, oh, these guys are pretty smart and so forth, if you at least allow for that, which colonials and imperials didn't often, then they would say, well, maybe these guys are the lost tribes. And that would happen. Anyway, that happens all the time as part of the Western colonial enterprise. There are also a host of native and indigenous communities around the world who self-identify as either the lost tribes or descendants of the lost tribes. And so, this includes sometimes when Native Americans or Pacific Islanders or the Maori or something have kind of adopted that as part of their identity because that was imposed on them by the Western colonizers and so forth. And if so, if that is a part of an indigenous person's identity, that's kind of their right in terms of, in my view, in terms of how are they identifying and standing up for themselves in the face of the oppressor not validating their native culture. This would be a little bit of a different thing where for many centuries in a lot of cases, groups in India or Asia, Africa, have identified, like I say, and claiming descent from one or more of the lost tribes. So for example, in India, there's a little group known as the Beni Ephraim who claim descent from Ephraim, one of those two major northern tribes. And there's another one called the Beni Manasseh who claim descent from Manasseh. In Ethiopia, there's a group called Beta Israel who believe they are descended from the lost tribe of Dan, although they're more vociferous about their claim that they're descended from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, which also, anyway, is an earlier claim, therefore, or a claim to have even earlier priority. The Igbo Jews of Nigeria claim descent from all kinds of different lost tribes and so forth. So, in addition to that sort of native people who have kind of their own semi-Jewish or Israelite traditions that are also incorporated into their native cultures that they have, there's also then the other flip side of the imperialists. So in addition to seeing the lost 10 tribes in various non-Western civilizations around the world, some Europeans decided, well, hey, wait a second, maybe we are actually the 10 tribes. And so a major component of that is Anglo-Israelitism, and so this became a very popular idea, especially in the 19th century. But it's pretty alive to this day. The proponents of Anglo-Israelitism taught that Anglo-Saxons, the British and the Americans were actually God's true chosen people, that they are the descendants through migration of the lost 10 tribes. They are Ephraim and Manasseh, heirs to the covenant with Israel, and thus, there's all kinds of things where heirs to all of God's promises, and including the right to rule over the world and so forth. It's not just Anglo-Saxons and Anglo-Israelite that did this. We've talked about when we did our debunking the Da Vinci Code that kind of some of the source material, kind of ironically, for the kind of anti-Catholic narrative that is the Da Vinci Code, is actually based on a Franco-Israelitism narrative that's kind of pro-Catholic and is seeing the Franks as, the French, as being the actual lost tribes. So anyway, so different people have seen it in themselves, but of course, this is one. There's a major new religion in the 20th century called the Worldwide Church of God, founded by Herbert Armstrong, one of its central tenets was Anglo-Israelitism. So Israel is and the Anglo-Saxons, the Americans are the lost tribes and so forth. After Armstrong's death, the church has passed to his successor and has renounced that doctrine and has now become kind of a regular evangelical church called Grace Communion International. So the idea that the lineage of the lost tribes was intermixed among Anglo-Saxons also made its way into the Latter-day Saint movement. So Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, claimed descent from Joseph of Egypt, probably by way of his son Ephraim. And so based on the part of the book of Genesis where the patriarch Jacob, Israel, at the end of his life gives a series of blessings to each of his sons that again describes essentially kind of the contemporary understandings in the kingdom of Judah about these different tribal characteristics. And so they're not really about individuals, but they're rather about the territory. And so it gives one of the best blessings to Judah and says, the scepter shall not depart from the hand of Judah, which is something that you could imagine that if your patron was the king of Judah, that would be something that he would like. Although, ironically, what ends up happening is that after that blessing is written down, kind of maybe in the reign of King Josiah, it's really within a few generations that this dynasty that has lasted centuries is extinguished, and the scepter does depart from them, so that that biblical prophecy immediately goes south after it's actually articulated. But it also gives special, and the strongest blessings that are aside from Judah are given to, again, Ephraim, especially, and Manasseh, because those are the center tribes of the northern kingdom. So, as a tradition based on that, the patriarchal blessings that are given by the patriarch Jacob, Mormons are regularly given patriarchal blessings, and part of that, a component of that, is an indication of lineage, which is almost always by custom, you're identified as being from the tribe of Ephraim, as you would say it in the Mormon pronunciation, Ephraim. And so nowadays, I think many Mormons kind of think of themselves as being adopted into that tribe, but certainly back in the original times, there are a lot of people who felt that was literal. So, and Mormons are very keen on doing genealogy and things like that and having lineage. And so part of the idea of that lineage is Joseph Smith is literally a literal descendant of Joseph of Egypt, and some of the other, some of the other people were, I'm sure, understood that that indication of descent or being part of the tribe of Ephraim as indicating a literal descent as well. So. The problem for everybody who is making, like I say, those sorts of literal claims, whether it's you're feeling that your patriarchal blessing has indicated that you are literally from the tribe of Ephraim, whether it's the worldwide Church of God that is saying that the true Anglo-Saxons or whatever are actually the true lost tribes of Israel, whether it is imperialists that are sailing around and saying, wow, these civilized people must really be the lost tribes, or even whether you are native peoples who have identified yourselves as at some descent from one of these tribes. In terms of that being a claim that has any historical reality, the problems with these are many, which are one, none of the biblical characters here is a historical person. As we saw, these are all mythic figures, and they are created at the time that the text is being written, using puns on names in order to create an eponymous ancestor. An ancestor, in other words, that has the name of the people that now exist. So it's like if we were telling a story in North America, and Canada is one of the characters, and Montana is a character, in Colorado, and they go visit, their sister, Louisiana, and so on. And so it'd be the same. It's the same kind of a story where you take the existing names and then you create an eponymous ancestor. Also, another thing that's true is that all of the peoples likely emerged from a common Canaanite background. There never were just 12 tribes. The number 12 here is an artificial magic number. The tribes that made the list did so because of relationships that made sense to the people in the court of Judah. So in other words, the Judahites themselves and also the Israelite exiles in the late 7th century. And so they decided that they had a closer relationship to the people in Naphtali, the people who had been up by the Sea of Galilee, than they do to the Edomites, who they like to turn their nose up around and think that they're smarter than our nearby neighbors, who we want to still look down upon and so forth. And of course, very serious complaint to any kind of continuity for your claim is that and the reason why all current identifications with the 12 tribes are revivals, because no matter how many centuries a culture has of this descent from the lost tribes, it can't descend all the way to continuity with exiles who were not lost physically, but were only lost as a coherent identity. And so you might say, well, we're doing all these things. We have in our culture, one of the examples is we have rabbis and we follow Jewish law in all these kind of ways. Well, that wouldn't connect you to, pre-fall of the Northern Kingdom style of Israelite religion, because rabbis are only part of the tradition, many, many centuries later, towards the end of Second Temple Judaism. Likewise, having all of the people obeying sort of Jewish law and things like that, that only comes into play a century or two before Jesus' time. And so it doesn't actually indicate that you have connections to people from the ancient kingdom of Israel, these lost tribes. It actually maybe is talking about a connection that you might have sometime in the Middle Ages or in more recent modern times to Jewish people and so forth, but or some other kind of a revival based on the fact that Abrahamic religion, through the much larger daughters, Christianity and Islam, have been so influential all around the world. And so that, taken all together, is my survey of the lost 10 tribes, where the tribes came from, how did where they went, where they actually went, and just some of the different ways that people have had revivals and have seen themselves as sharing in lost tribal identity and so forth. And so I'll get a glass of water and we'll ask Leandro if any of that has caused you guys to have any questions or comments.
Comments, for sure.
So Raymond Ortiz asks, can you explain the symbolism of the molten sea that was placed on the backs of the 12 oxen in Solomon's temple? So yeah, the 12 oxen here are going to represent, this idea then of 12 tribes, I think. And so in other words, 12 in any event is a magic number. And so at some point or other, all of these different 12s become kind of the number of the kingdom. So, I've read a science fiction story that's set in the future that denied that there could ever have been 50 U.S. states, because 50 is such a perfect number, it has to be kind of symbolic. So at a certain point, 50 becomes, with 50 stars in the flag and things like that, that becomes kind of a symbol of having a group of United States. It does work out right now that we have 50. But at some point or other, 12 is sort of essentially a symbolic number of the tribes of Israel. And so that's what that would relate to. But they wouldn't have necessarily had, as we kind of saw, they wouldn't have necessarily had even what the list of it is. So those different oxen wouldn't have each had a name. In other words, Gad wouldn't have been written on each one, because precisely which tribes constitute the 12 may not be known. In some lists, Gilead, and some of the stories, Gilead would have been one of the tribes. Donnie Lee Gringo says, does John have any clue where... Oh, it's a related question. Does John have any clue where Joseph Smith and or the Nauvoo, Illinois members got the idea of 12 oxen's named for the tribes in their temples? So it comes from the Bible. So in other words, there is a, like Raymond's calling it, a molten sea. There is a basin, a water font, that is outside of, it's in Solomon's temple, outside of the inner sanctuary. And it is used, we talked about this just last week in terms of John the Baptist. We talked about the Jewish purification practice. So the priests have to become be involved in ritual bathing in order to achieve ritual purity. And so the basin is for that. It's for ritual washing. It is not for baptism, which is the Christian takeoff of priestly purification rituals that begin with John the Baptist and evolve through Christian practice. So when Joseph Smith makes his 12 oxen baptismal font in the basement of the Nauvoo Temple, it's explicitly a baptismal font because it's now based on the Christian tradition. And then on top of that, because of a passage in Corinthians where Paul says, why then are they baptized for the dead if the dead rise not at all, or something like that. And so, kind of unpacking that and reinterpreting it, that they came up with the idea that they needed to do proxy baptisms for the dead. And so therefore what ends up happening is the temple baptismal font is used for proxy baptisms for people who have died. And we mentioned how Mormons do genealogy work. So one of the things they do is when they get names of people is that they will then baptize them in the temples. And so then there's essentially in all Mormon temples there are now these baptismal fonts that are on the backs of 12 oxen that are symbolically representing the 12 tribes. Wednesday Jones, well, thank you for your support. Wednesday asks, back in the day, did the RLDS church also give lineage during an evangelist blessing? So we have this tradition as well. We call it the evangelist blessing. The name of the blessing actually goes back all the way to the beginning when the RLDS church and the LDS church were the same church. We call it, I say, the early church, the early Latter-day Saint tradition church. The office of patriarch, the office of evangelist, use those two words interchangeably. And so the original blessings were the same. And so yes, at the beginning, the tradition involved, including a lineage thing, although it didn't happen for everybody and it wasn't for everybody. And so sometimes the original presiding evangelist was Joseph Smith Sr. And so he would often give a lineage, and he would often give it as Ephraim. And that tradition did continue in the reorganization, but I don't know how recently. I don't think it's very common anymore. I think you could still do it. I don't know. Anyway, I haven't read enough people's evangelical blessings to know if that ever happens at all anymore, or when it died out. But at some point it died out, mostly. Buying Space says, have you heard that some African American people are saying that the lost tribes migrated south into Africa and that people kidnapped from the west into slavery, that they were God's chosen people? Yes, I have heard that. And so this is kind of like a middle path between the kind of like the white Anglo-Israelitism and the native peoples claiming to be the lost tribes. So it is a modern association, a revival. It's not, so unlike Anglo-Israelism, which is kind of racism and from, wanting to claim you're the best from the oppressive structure, it is it's reading kind of, I think, enslaved people who had been, enslaved as this horrible tragedy of the Western colonial experience, who became Christian, who read the biblical stories, who heard in the biblical stories Moses saying to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," who is condemning bondage and condemning Israel in bondage. They read those or heard those stories and incorporated them as a way to want to be liberated against their oppressors, who happen to be, white Christians. And so in part of that, they could also have, they also developed, as you say, some of them anyway, also developed ideas that in fact, that they are themselves descendants from the lost tribes of Israel. And so yes, that I I almost put that on, but it didn't fit into either of those categories, but it would certainly be another one of those kinds of categories. Is it Lenberg says, or is it Leonberg, or is it Leon? Okay, Leonberg says, do we know any RLDS Community of Christ history that emphasize the return of the lost 10 tribes the way Mormons do? So there's this idea at the beginning of the movement that continues to be maintained in the Utah tradition, because the Utah tradition continues to be very literalistic in their reading of scripture and so forth, and predictions. So the beginning of the movement was very much believed that they were living into the latter days quite literally. In other words, the end of the world already, by all predictions of Joseph Smith, that already needed to happen if his predictions had come true by the 1890s, and probably much earlier than that. So in the 1830, they all thought it was going to be done in the 1830s. And so they believed the last 10 tribes were returning. So they believed that the Native Americans were remnant of the tribe of Manasseh. They believed that they themselves were intermingled remnants of Ephraim, who is part, who were being gathered, because when the missionaries went around, the people whose hearts were touched were the ones that probably had this heritage and lineage. And so they would have had that same thing in the early reorganization. That would have been the same inheritance. But it's the kind of thing that happens, which is what happens for people when prophecy fails. So your literal understanding of an end of the world and millennium, that's been proved wrong. That didn't happen. So now how do you react to that? So one of the ways is you continuously change your math, and you always more or less are saying, kind of like LDS people do, that it's about to happen 30 years in the future from now, and that move point changes over the course of anybody's lifetime. Presumably, like I said, when I was growing up in the 70s, we were already very assured that it would have been happening already before now. But now, anybody who's alive now probably thinks it's happening 30 years from now. So that's just more or less how you do it. Or you do like in Community of Christ, where I think that we understand this more. We are now more, I think, understanding the coming kingdom of the millennium of God and so on as something that has already been realized throughout all of the Christian era, and is simply, we are getting ever closer to God's kingdom on earth, the way God would want it to be lived, when we are acting, when we are loving for love's sake and so forth, when we are building community in ways that is bringing about having there be peace on earth and so on. And so there has been a lot of improvement, but obviously we're still falling very far short of that. So Operation Ivy asks, did the Jews around the time of the beginning of Christianity already understand these figures to be mythical, and what did they think of the lost 10 tribes? No. I don't think they did. I think that they read text and they thought that the text happened. They didn't think of it as history the way we understand history. So we have an amazing awareness of historicity. We have developed the entire modern understanding of history, and that things have been changing a lot. People in the past assumed that stories that you're hearing about, the Hercules and so on, was a guy who'd run around and he'd done those things. They would largely, at the time period around the time of Jesus and Christianity, they would largely assume that some of the more magical or supernatural things that happened in the stories, they would come up with more naturalistic explanations for those, but they would largely assume that they were the case. And so what did some of them think? So Josephus, who is the main Jewish historian whose work survived from that time, he thought that some of the lost tribes were ongoing, living in northern Assyria and so forth, and so he told kind of some stories about that. So so he doesn't think, I don't think that he thinks that they're off living somewhere hidden, but rather that, that there may be some remnant that is existing still in northern Assyria. Brandon Wright says, does this mythic genealogy contribute to the Jewish practices and Zionism adopted by some modern evangelists like John Hagee? Yes. So again, the modern Jewish fundamentalists and also modern Christian evangelical fundamentalists read these texts literally. They kind of would like to, kind of have an expansionistic idea of where Israel, a literal Israel, political Israel should be, that includes wiping out peoples, or displacing anyway, peoples that have more or less lived there forever, and so unfortunately, that has been an underpinning for some of the extremist Zionism anyway, and unfortunately they have allies in fundamentalist Christians who ironically are trying to get the Zionists destroyed. In other words, they kind of, so that they can have an end of the world happen where pretty much everybody's destroyed except for the evangelicals that are going to get lifted into heaven during the rapture and so forth. Can we move these up, Leandro?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So Rick Sanchez says, sincerely, even with all the fabricated origins, what about the Battle Creek Stone, Columbus being a converso Marrano, and so forth? The Battle Creek Stone is a forgery. It's a fraud. All of these are. It's one of a bazillion of these, and so that's what. So Columbus being a converso, no. Columbus is an Italian, so he's from. Oh, you mean so? I mean he's Marrano. I mean, you're trying to say he's in Spain, one of the Andalusians or something like that. I'm not sure what you're saying in that. Columbus anyway is from Genoa. So there we are. Well, anyway, is that all, Leandro? All right, well, thank you so much. I think this was a fun one. We'll have potentially even a funner one. I'll certainly have fun next week as we are talking about the life of Brian.
You might be alone here next week, depending on results of soccer. So.
Okay, well, we'll see. Yeah, if it's the World Cup, we'll see what happens.